Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Tuning in to the latest episode of Inflection Point Podcast, where we are dedicated to anti-racism activation and the art of listening in authentic conversation, engagement, and action. I am your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis Bauman and Gail Hunter.
Hi, folks. I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome.
Excellent, excellent. So if you have been listening to us throughout 2025, you know that our theme for the year has been community engagement and the grassroots of change. So throughout the year, we've been exploring stories and strategies and successes of community-driven movements that are making a difference. And so each episode will focus on theory and practice, allowing our audience to gain insights that they can apply in real-world community engagement efforts. So we have a really exciting topic today. It's kind of a deep topic at the same time. And the title of this episode is "The Sovereign Psyche Starts in the Community: Expanding Cooperative Economics and Collective Power." So we will be exploring the connection between community engagement, cooperative economics, and sovereignty. And we're going to be looking at sovereignty through the work of Ezrah Aharone, adjunct professor of political science at Delaware State University. So this professor writes some really, really deep stuff on this topic of sovereign psyche. So we're going to just jump right on in and start kind of building off of this subtopic, community engagement and cooperative economics, the bridge to sovereignty. And so our position is that community engagement and cooperative economics serve as a bridge to sovereignty. So Mavis and Gail, when you think about that bridge to sovereignty, what are some of the things that right off the top of your head just kind of pop up?
Well, I would like to encourage whoever's listening, don't get scared. This is deep. It's really kind of a simple concept. I had to sit with a little bit to see how those things are connected, and it's beautiful. It's simple. The idea of cooperative economics, community discussions, and so on, to sovereign psyche. It's about knowing who we are and reinforcing that in each other, our identity. So hang in there.
That's right. It's really a shift in mindset. And the cooperative economics and the community engagement are very crucial to create that type and that level and depth of a mindset shift, so that they all fit together in a beautiful way. And as Mavis said, just sit tight and just keep listening. It will
just
make
big
sense.
Words for now.
Yeah.
So let's start off with some definitions, right? If you saw our episode, the last episode, we've been talking about this community engagement and cooperative economics. In the last two episodes, we explored that through the Ujima Collective. So I'm just going to kind of refresh our audience mind in terms of what some of these definitions are. So let's start with community engagement, which is the intentional process of involving people in collective action to address local issues, shape decisions, and build power through participation, dialogue, and trust. And so it centers on equity, shared leadership, and long-term capacity building. Then we have cooperative economics, which is an economic model that emphasizes democratic ownership, shared resources, and mutual benefit. And to a great extent, it's rooted in traditions such as Black cooperative movements and solidarity economies. It redirects capital and labor away from extraction and towards regeneration and reciprocity. And then finally, sovereignty is I love this definition. Sovereignty is an energizing mindset. It's consciousness and the thought process by which people define and express freedom through the unique particularities of their political and ideological self-identity. And that particular definition comes from Professor Ezrah Aharone, who is the gentleman that is sort of at center stage in this particular conversation. So let's kind of dive in a little bit more. We got the definitions out of the way. So let's kind of think about this through the lens of reimagining the power of we. And so if you think about community engagement and cooperative economics, what lies beyond that? Beyond that is where sovereignty resides, right? And so we believe first and foremost in aligning these two transformative processes, the community engagement and the cooperative economics. But those transformative processes in turn have the potential to fuel movement towards sovereignty. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Professor Ezrah Aharone. He is a Hampton University graduate and professor at Delaware State University, where he teaches global societies and specializes in sovereign studies and operational knowledge. He is the conceptualizer and the founding executive director of the Center for Global Africa at Delaware State University that works to advance the African diasporic engagements and strengthen joint U.S. Africa governance, policymaking, and socioeconomic productivity. He commonly makes presentations and interfaces with leaders at high levels of government, industry, and civil society in Africa, where he organizes U.S. and diaspora delegations and missions to problem solve issues for major impact. He is a seminal author, a syndicated columnist, a political intellectual, public diplomat who has lived in several African countries, and he works as a strategic subject matter expert to governments and businesses and institutions. So his body of work is where this conversation is flowing from today. And so there are three. Oh, yes.
Just one second. I just want to expand on the definition of sovereignty here for just a minute for listeners. When I think of sovereignty, I think of sovereign countries or sovereign property, sovereign jurisdiction, something like that. But what we're talking about here has to do, as his book title says, with the psyche. Having sovereignty over your own mind. So when you hear that word as we go forward, just think about it that way. I don't want people to think that we're talking about a sovereign movement that would, in this particular case, change countries right now. We're talking about mindsets, as Gail said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I want to list out what his three seminal publications are. And the first one is The Sovereign Psyche. And it talks about these systems of chattel freedom versus self-authentic freedom. And then the next book is Sovereign Evolution, Manifest Destiny from Civil Rights to Sovereign Rights. And then Pond Sovereignty is Sharpening Black Perspectives on Americanization, Africa, War, and Reparations. But for this conversation, we're only focusing, to Mavis's point, we're only focusing on the sovereign psyche. Okay. So Gail, can you kind of chime in and, share with the audience when you think of the word sovereign psyche, how does that resonate with you?
To me, it says that no one has that right to tell me who I am and to tell me whether I am deserving of whatever, that I have a right to be here. I have a right as a human being. I have a right to be respected. I have a right to choose my independence. I have a right to make all kinds of choices. And so he's writing this in reference to certainly people of color and African Americans that have not had that right. And even though our Constitution may say that all men are created equal, it did not really include women, and it certainly did not include people of color. The words may be accurate, but the intention behind them was not. But so this means that those words would actually be accurate, and the experience of everyone would be the mindset that I have the ability to say, this is who I am. And I listen to myself and what I believe, and that basic human right, right? And so to have that sovereignty is really, we take it for granted. If your skin color is white, you're going to take this for granted. If your skin color is not white, you will not take that for granted. But this is really important. And it's a very powerful and empowering message for everyone to begin to really listen to and hear.
Absolutely, absolutely. And fundamentally, it's really about this idea of your own consciousness, right? And so we've talked in the past about socialization as an example, how we get socialized into thinking, behaving, defining, interacting, and all of that. That gets shaped within us. When you think about where you are in your family, your community, where you go to school, where you go to church, and all of these different factors that influence and socialize us. So if go ahead, maybe
they're imprints. They're imprints that happen.
Oh, yes.
Right? Yeah. And they may or may not resonate directly with that being that I feel I am, but they can be very powerful, and the imprints can be overpowering.
Yeah, and it
obstructs authentic and accurate.
Right, and it obstructs self-determination.
That's right.
All along the way.
Choices. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, like I think about it also within the context of monolithic thinking, right? All Black people are this, all Mexican people are that, all Asian people are this. And so it's this outer definition, if you will, that gets pinned on us. It's like pin the tail on a donkey, and we get this like label pinned on us. But the thing that's really important is whether or not you buy into those labels that are pinned on you by some outer society or some outer systemic way of thinking, or are you consciously aware of who you are, your own identity, your own history, your own experiences? And I think that is particularly important when those labels that people try to pin the donkey onto you, when those labels are labeled or added to you, it's up to you to make that decision internally. Am I going to accept that? Am I going to assimilate into that? Am I going to receive that? Or do I wholeheartedly reject that based on my knowledge, my experience, my history, my consciousness of who I am?
Right. Absolutely. We have to question. And, I'd like to distinguish here between sovereignty of the mind and societal governance. In order to live together, we are going to have to develop some rules of behavior, and those rules have to be communicated, and we have to adhere to them in order to live together peacefully. But even with those kinds of rules, question, right? We are in this big battle now for a huge bill. We as Americans need to question. and decide what is really being pushed toward us and how we feel about it and how that makes us feel about ourselves and think of ourselves. Are we exercising the right to freedom or is it being diminished?
Mm-hmm. And I also like to think of it very much so as being this evolutionary process, right? And so, like when I think about you, Mavis, part of your story is you spent most of your life growing up, your youth being a free range chicken and all of those different things in Nebraska. And then you went to university. And when you went to university, you started to see things through a different lens. And one of the things that you've shared with me so many times over the course of our friendship, that you always had sort of this underlying interest in other cultures and people, though those other cultures and people weren't necessarily part of your upbringing, but there was something there that interested you. And so when I look at that, it's almost as if you were looking for something outside of the consciousness that had evolved in you up until that point in time.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure I can say why, but I'm so glad I did explore, because it has helped put my world and the way I view others into much different perspective, a much healthier, a much more loving perspective. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to have done that. Also, in addition to education, is travel. When you travel and you see how people live and how they treat you, and you realize we are all the same. And this is the sovereign psyche, part of the sovereign psyche that we want to protect. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah. And what you just said, we want to protect. It's about us protecting the fragility of our identity.
Right.
Because when you think about like little kids and you think about children when they're just kind of out and about, how easy it is for them to have an experience that shapes how they think and believe about a particular thing or a person or something along those lines, right?
Right away, right? Happens
right, exactly. And if it's something negative, if a child witnesses something negative, and when I say negative, I mean in terms of if they witness a person being mean, if you will, in speaking in a vernacular of a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
If Cairo sees somebody doing something mean, right, he's either going to recognize that that's mean based on what he's been socialized to define as mean, or he's just going to accept that and maybe even mimic that type of behavior, right? And so this idea of this consciousness, it's really fascinating when you think about it through the lens of little kids. And the audience, you'll hear me speak of Cairo quite a bit because his mind is so incredible. And it's that level of consciousness of who he is, even within the body, this little body of a 5-year-old. So all of this stuff, that we're talking about, this sovereign psyche, it's something that evolves over the course of time. And as we evolve, sometimes we start shedding things. We start shedding things as maybe you take on new knowledge, you take on new experiences, you travel, you're around other people, other cultures, and there's certain things that may have been a part of your psyche that start to go away.
Always. Yeah. It's quite an experience to be around people, especially who don't speak your language and what is communicated anyway. Those are the real human sensibilities that are totally aside from control or influence. It's just relating it's loving, it's helping, it's giving, it's teaching. No, oh, I just love it. I could do it all the time.
Mhm.
It's really wonderful. And I was thinking too about children. They can be, and we all really have been, socialized as to what is acceptable.
Absolutely.
Whether it comes to the first image that comes to my mind is sacrificing or killing animals. You grow up on a farm, it is the way it is. Animals are butchered for food. But in other locations, you might not have gained that acceptability. This is where, again, you reach into your own sovereignty and decide what is acceptable to you and what you want to accept in others or not.
Exactly. So again, I love the way the professor really focuses on from a psyche perspective. So your input, Gail?
Yeah, it's really about no one has the power to determine who you are unless you let them. And so this is about really knowing what you believe and believing authentically in yourself and giving that permission to have it, no matter what somebody is saying to you or isn't saying to you, that this is really about a mindset that is the basic human right of all of us. Right?
Yes.
That we all have a right to choose this for ourselves.
Exactly.
And many people may try to convince you throughout your life and that it's not this, it's that. But you have the power to determine that.
Yes.
And that's what that sovereignty really is about.
Yes.
Right. And so he goes on to explain this concept of sovereign psyche through the comparison of systems of chattel freedom versus self-authentic freedom. And so I'm going to read this quote that kind of goes into where he's coming from with these two comparisons. Beyond racism and police shootings, Black/African people are unknowingly in a 21st century struggle of intellectual and institutional warfare. This is being uniquely waged on mental and ideological battlegrounds of what I define as that sovereign psyche, which definitively becomes the most valuable commodity this century. So that's a really powerful statement. And where that statement originated from was in 1943, as the Germans were expanding their territorial concepts. We all know what was happening in this time period. Winston Churchill delivered a speech at Harvard University where he made this particular proclamation, right? The empires of the future are the empires of the mind. And the note was recognizing that this statement was being made during a time when European nations were imperialists themselves, colonizing territories worldwide, including Africa in particular. And so the professor's response to that is, in other words, instead of butchering Africans and others through colonial subjugation, Europeans would dominate the world via superior sovereign intellect, backed by superior sovereign systems and sovereign institutions. And as this work demonstrates, the outcome of this warfare have produced varying degrees of chattel freedom for Black and African people worldwide. So I'm going to read you what that definition, because when I first saw that phrase, I wasn't quite sure where he was coming from. But chattel freedom is when the value of a people is dependent upon the extent to which they serve the interests and institutions of others. So when you think about the idea of slavery, which eventually evolved into us now having conversations about racism on a very different kind of level. And when you think about where we are in this anti-racism, we're in this battle around anti-racism and racism and all of these things. And I'm specifically focusing on racism purposely. But this idea of chattel freedom is that within the context of where we are today, right? Our value is predicated upon the extent to which I, as a Black person, can serve the interests and the institutions of what is out there surrounding me. So do I assimilate into these systems, or do you get to a point and a place where you say, I'd rather create my own system and have that, what was the phrase, true or self-authentic freedom? Mm-hmm. So it boils down to, which would you prefer? When I think about where we are right now and everything that we're going through under this administration, I think we're at least I could say for me, at this place. Do I want to continue this chattel freedom kind of thing? Or do I want to experience self-authentic freedom? So for me, I choose self-authentic freedom, which is the reason why I made my choice to move into working with Ujamaa from that cooperative economics perspective. That was a huge move for me. And I feel like that was my shift from looking at things through that chattel freedom to self-authentic freedom.
What comes to mind to me right now is my decision as a white person to participate in this podcast is against the input that I get from a very big part of my world. Mm-hmm. A very big part of my world. So I have made the personal decision to learn what is happening to Black folks in our country and how we can affect that. I mean, we all are, but making those choices for self-authentic freedom, is that right? Mm-hmm. Can be difficult. It can be difficult. It can be swimming upstream. It can be forcing laws to change, working towards that. So I guess I just want to encourage people to stretch out of the boundaries they may not even know are being enforced on them. Right. Mm-hmm. Psychologically, right?
Right. And I think it's imperative that we all stretch beyond that, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you really listen to what is happening, there's a tremendous amount of external input trying to convince us all that people that are Hispanic or people that are immigrants or people that whatever that are somehow need to be removed from the country, and people that aren't naturalized citizens and maybe even citizens that should be removed if they're. And so if you really listen to what's happening, it's an attempt to take away that self-authentic freedom of that I can choose to, and I can see and I can know what I believe. And you can't tell me that that's not true. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
And when you link that back to, we're going to take a break, but I want to just kind of link back to this idea of chattel freedom, when the value of a people is predicated upon the extent to which they serve the interests and institutions of others. But what happens when you get to the point where you are no longer serving in the way it's been defined for you to serve? And I think that's what we're starting to see right here, right now, with where the whole issue with the immigrants. It started to be very, very evident that the immigrants actually served a purpose here. I'm not talking about criminal
Major.
drug lords or anything. I'm talking about everyday working immigrants, and we're starting to see the role that they played. But because the value that was on that was a very low value, their real value was never really seen until now they're gone.
That's right.
So we're going to go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back and get into the second half of this conversation. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast as we continue our 2025 journey into community engagement and the grassroots of change. And in this episode, we are exploring this concept of sovereign psyche. So on the break, Mavis made a pretty interesting statement. So I'm going to go back and reread.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go back and reread what we said about this whole concept of chattel freedom is what we were talking about. So chattel freedom is when the value of a person is predicated upon the extent to which they serve the interests and institutions of others.
Right, right. And the word that bothers me there is others, because it really is about oppressors, people who have control over other people. So, for example, I might belong to a church that has some opinions and directives, but I'm not under their control. They might influence me, but I'm not oppressed by them. And, in the case of this chattel slavery, clearly people were oppressed and not free in any way. So I think we need to distinguish that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad, because it was in my mind to connect that phrase of chattel freedom to its cousin, if you will, chattel slavery, because that was what we had in this country, was based on this system of chattel slavery. So just the fact that the word chattel is still there lets you know that this is not really freedom in the way that we're talking about when it comes to this sovereign psyche. Right?
Right. Good stuff.
Absolutely. And so here's an idea. The central premise of the professor's work, therefore, is this: there is no such thing as intellectual or institutional equality between Black and white America. It doesn't exist, right? A primary cause and contributor to all racial disproportions and injustices is that Black America lacks the equivalent strength of institutions and appropriate, I love this statement, of institutions and appropriate end use of our intellect.
Yes.
Because our intellect was not used for our growth and development. It was used for the growth and development of this nation. And it was robbed from us to build out this nation. And so when you think about where we are, when you look at how many videos or documentaries have you seen where it says slaves built this, or it was a slave that created that. Right. All of that came from our intellectual interior, if you will, but we didn't own it.
Well, no one allowed you to have a voice either.
That's right. And there's been a movement to try to erase all that, all the information. Right? It's the same thing, right? It's doing the same thing.
Yeah,
exactly.
Erasing everything. Yeah.
Yeah, it's literally, I mean, when I think about just the whole concept of Black history, like I've been immersed in Black history my entire life. Like I can't even remember a point in my life when I just wasn't immersed or aware of Black history. But there's so many people who that is a complete blank slate.
Mhm.
I mean, a complete
Completely.
slate,
Right.
right? And so when you're trying to sort of look at this psyche through different groups or different ways of thinking, different levels of consciousness. So if you have a level of consciousness where this has never been on your radar screen, like I've never seen any of this, I've never heard of any of this. And then you stand next to somebody like me who, like, I've been studying this stuff since I was like 12 or something.
Studying and living it.
And living it. Exactly. Exactly. And so to understand this whole thing of sovereign psyche is really recognizing that the interior of me, in the depth of who I am as a Black woman living in America, is completely different from the interior of somebody who could go and cast their vote for the person that we have in office right now. My interior,
Good point.
my interior design is completely different because of the level of awareness of who I am my entire life. Right? So that sovereign psyche and that whole thing of just knowing who you are and not taking on any of that stuff that somebody else says that you are or who you are. You can't do that. You can't do this.
You aren't that. You aren't this.
Exactly.
I think we call that gaslighting, don't we?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not based in truth, but it's manipulative. It's like brainwashing, right? Convincing the others that what I'm saying is true when it's not.
Well, I often say that I'm so grateful to my fellow podcasters here for forcing me to think about my identity, because I never had to. And so I never did. I just knew my name, where I lived, the basic coordinates, right? And when you really get deeper into who you are, what you stand for, what you love, what you're willing to fight or sacrifice for, it's a whole new ballgame. Whole new ballgame.
Okay, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So here's another quote from this professor. Colonialism was not just a theft of land, but a reprogramming of thought. Liberation requires more than changing laws. It requires changing minds. Black people must operate from indigenous frames of power, not Eurocentric paradigms. And so when you break that apart, colonialism was not just a theft of land. It was a theft of culture. It was a theft of social systems that already existed, and reprogramming of how we think about ourselves. If you take a group of people from Africa and put them on a ship and bring them to a foreign land, they have to be reprogrammed.
Totally broken.
Deprogrammed, I should say. Deprogrammed from their language and their culture and their upbringing and their traditions and their families and their stories. You have to deprogram and replace all of that consciousness of who I am as an African with something else.
So Anita especially, but Gail too, how would you see that playing out? Black people must operate from indigenous frames of power. How would that play out today?
It's the power that they had when they were still in Africa.
Don't scare
the Native Americans before the white people came, right? It's because it's based on the absolute truth of the I'm of who they are and had been. And that is how I would look at that.
But how would it play out in this country? let's
They
say.
had to change. They had to change it.
What if Black people began to operate from that indigenous frame of power?
That's what they will then experience, that empowerment, because they'll access that very core basic truth of who they are and who they've always been.
I mean, can you
Instead of what has been
imagine?
told to them or taught to them.
Yeah. Can you imagine the richness
Oh.
that is underground,
Yes.
because of this? And
Yeah.
I just want listeners to not freak out about, operating from indigenous power. It's about operating in wholeness, right?
Right. But
Right.
here's when you asked that question just now,
Mhm.
you want to know what came into my mind?
Tell me.
The thing that came into my mind, if you remember when we were in South Africa, that one time when we were at that, it was like a clinic, and we were around all of these people, babies and adults, and we were there to train them on the breast self-examination.
Mhm.
I had such a powerful moment.
Oh.
At one point, I literally removed myself from the group because I had such a powerful moment of connection on a level that I had never experienced before. For me, that was like an indigenous moment
Wow.
because I'm standing here. I know I'm rooted in Africa. I found out later that it isn't South Africa that I was rooted in. It's more Sierra Leone and all of that. But in that moment, I felt rooted to the motherland and being in the presence of all of these people. And you got to admit, Mavis, the way we had to operate, we were operating indigenously. Remember the one building we were in and we had no electricity? And they went and got this long cord that came from somebody's house and moved. And so we were able to get electricity. I think that's what he's talking about here.
The natural creativity.
Exactly. And that connection on a different level. Like everything that I know as an American, when I went to South Africa, it was a different part of my identity that was activated when I was there.
Wow.
And I feel like that's that indigenous thing that is being
never said quite that before. That is really powerful to me. That is really powerful.
And had I not been willing to do that, I may have had a completely different response, or just like I said with the electricity, just observing how they came together. I'm getting all this weird light coming in, but observing how they all came together to make sure that we had electricity. We're not used to that. We're used to walking into the house and just flipping the switch and the light comes on. They literally it was the longest cord I've ever seen in my life, but it literally stretched from somebody's home all the way over to where we were so that our computers from America could have power. That's that indigenous frame of power.
And they're problem solving like that.
Absolutely.
All day. And they're happy, they're not stopped in their tracks by that.
Right.
It's when the sun starts setting, it gets rough, doesn't it?
I'm trying to fix it.
Yeah, I just think that's really powerful again, Anita.
Yeah, so I'm glad you called that out though.
Yeah, it's really empowering. Yes.
And I didn't really think about it when I was putting this together and writing it and everything. But when you asked that question, it took me right to South Africa.
And isn't that a gorgeous thing? This is what I keep wanting to stress tonight, is that this is not something to fear. White people, don't be afraid. This is about living fully in our humanity and respecting each other. And that's all. It's not scary. It's not complicated.
Everyone has that basic human right to do that.
Yes.
Experience that, to know that truth.
Absolutely. So I want to finish this one piece.
I love this next quote.
Right. In this conversation, power is not what others give you. It's what you have when you know who you are.
Mm.
And I think about that. Like, if you go back to roots, remember Kunta Kinte? And how many times he tried to escape because he couldn't let go of who he was. And so he went through this constant battle almost between who he was and this power that was trying to pull him in a different direction that dishonored who he was.
Right.
So it's not about that power that I have to wait for somebody to give me. It's because I know who I am, irrespective of how someone else may want to see me, perceive me, or define me.
Right.
I've already defined myself.
And, you know, that's true of most subgroups. I'm trying to think of one it's not. Women, we are who we say we are.
Right.
We are not disabled. We are not weak. We are not a whole bunch of things that have been thrust onto us. And we've had to fight for our own sovereignty of the
Absolutely.
believe that enough to step forward.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then let's connect all of this to community engagement. Community engagement becomes the first step in building a sovereign psyche, not because it fixes everything, but because it awakens collective memory and practices shared agency. So when we gather in circles, we claim our voice. When we solve problems together, we reject saviorism. When we trust each other, we chip away at the internalized lie that we are alone and powerless. And so community becomes the mirror that reflects the sovereign self back to us.
That is so gorgeous.
I love that.
can't
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
It's so gorgeous.
Yes, it really is.
Yeah. Trust. We can trust each other.
Well, it creates trust,
Absolutely.
right? Because it's respect there.
Right. Right.
And when I think about Ujima,
Yeah. That's
like all of this comes to life for me.
Right. Sure.
When I think about Ujima, right? And then cooperative economics, sovereignty in action is expressed through institutional capacity and control over destiny. So that's what cooperative economics offers: shared ownership, not corporate dependency; democratic governance, not elite rule; wealth circulation, not extractive capitalism. When we build cooperatives, credit unions, worker-owned businesses, land trusts, we are reprogramming our relationship to power and value. We are declaring our labor, our land, and our leadership belong to us.
Yes. Yes.
wow.
Yeah,
We're in these times.
yeah. And
That's it.
These times for sure.
exactly. And I feel like with all the stuff that's going on up here, but then there's all this other stuff that's going on down at this other level. Right? And it's strengthening us.
Yes. Yes.
And then it goes on to say, without a sovereign psyche, economic development can replicate colonial structures. So, for example, when you get a grant, but there's strings attached to that grant, or when you have business models that mimic inequality, or you have policies that prioritize GDP over dignity.
Dignity.
Right? But with a sovereign psyche, development becomes rooted in culture and community. Leadership flows from the grassroots, and economics become a tool of self-definition and not assimilation. This is some powerful stuff.
It's powerful stuff.
Very powerful.
And it's not a downward pressure in any way on economic growth.
No, it's
Right, absolutely.
It's not an anti thing.
No, it's supporting and promoting it.
Supporting and promoting it.
Exactly. But it's
with dignity.
right.
Exactly.
And I think the important thing is that we're doing it cooperatively.
Yes.
That's the thing. Capitalism, it ain't that cooperative.
No.
You know,
It's a hierarchy.
because or when you think about it in terms of all the stuff that we're talking about, community engagement and all of that, the well-being of the community is paramount, as opposed to the profitability of what it is we're doing. Yeah. The profitability obviously has to be there because we're in businesses, and you know, Ujima Collective is comprised of all these women with all these businesses, and so that piece of it is there, but that's not the essence.
Oh.
That's not what brings life to the work that we do. It's the sovereignty that we're working together
of the community, right?
And these sovereign, conscious ecosystems. That's what we're creating. That's what Ujima Collective is. It's this sovereign, conscious ecosystem, right?
Right? Ecosystems.
Ego. I'm sorry, not ego. I'm sorry. I stand corrected. Systems. Yes, ecosystems.
Yeah.
So we have about 3 minutes or so until we're going to leave. So I just need to kind of wind things down at this point and leave with this little nugget right here. Every community meeting, every local cooperative, every youth-led initiative is a step towards collective self-possession. We collectively own the work that goes on at Ujima, right? We're building together, recognizing that each one of us brings something valuable into what it is we're building. That's so beautiful. That is so beautiful. And so I want to leave our audience with this daily affirmation for sovereignty. And I want to thank Gail for finding this and sharing this with us. So this is a daily affirmation for sovereignty. Today, I stand in the power of my own name, my own vision, and my own truth. I am not defined by systems that did not create me. I define myself. My mind is my domain. My spirit is uncolonized. I walk in legacy, think with clarity, and build with purpose. I am sovereign, I am whole, and I am free. So sovereignty isn't about borders and flags. It's about consciousness. It's about culture and all of that. And it's about starting to build from within. So as always, we end our show with the Cairo question. Will 5-year-old Cairo have to fight in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? In other words, will 5-year-old Cairo be able to live a sovereign existence as he grows? So is it possible to imagine a future that is free from the shackles of divisiveness and meaningless conversations? We believe at Inflection Point Podcast that the answer is a resounding yes. And we all have a role to play. And the key is transformative engagement and sovereign psyche. So the question is, what will you do? If you're listening, what will you do to contribute? So you can start by joining our conversation on our private Facebook page under the podcast name of Inflection Point Podcast. So if you just go on Facebook under groups and look for Inflection Point Podcast, you will find us. And so I want to thank you all for joining and listening to our conversation. We are here every first and third Wednesday of the month, 3 p.m. Pacific time and 6 p.m. Eastern time, right here on Transformation Talk Radio. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.